Welcome to Module 1, Lesson 5, Part 1, Sources of Change in Developing Technology. Today we're going to talk about sources of change, or how do we get from there to here. Let's talk about the social effects on technology. Technology is a human creation. Humans are social creatures. So technological change is a social process. And there is a theory called social constructivism that states the idea that social structures and processes affect our technological choices. That technological change is inherently political. And when I use the word political, I'm not talking government political, I'm talking day-to-day, where we fit into social structure type of political. Let's talk about technology in everyday life. There is a point at which using a technology just becomes part of life. Okay? And that point is called technological closure. It's the accepted way of doing things. We don't often think of it as something outside the norm. It's the norm. So if you think about texting and using a cell phone, it is becoming, we're hitting that technological closure because people, you know, we're not tied down to a phone, a landline. Okay, a lot of people don't even have landlines anymore. So using a smartphone or using a mobile phone has hit technological closure in the United States. A lot of time, the way a technology is developed is tied to specific interest groups and their ability to affect what ones we select and what we don't. So, for instance, if I'm the manager of a group in a company and I have a certain budget for, say, mobile phones. All right. Now, a lot of times people will tell you that iPhones are better phones, that they're easier to use, that they're better, whatever. But I only have so much, and I have so many people that I have to to equip. So I may opt for an Android phone, which tend to be cheaper, okay, so that I can get everybody something. So in this case, I'm adopting a technology, or I'm steering towards a technology based on my ability, what meets my needs as a manager. The most impact when we see a sort of a political or an interest group influencing technological innovation is at the beginning of the technology. Okay, so it's interesting to note that when in the turn of the 1900s, when we went from the 19th century to the 20th century, that automobiles there were all different types of how they were powered. One was steam, one was electric. There were actually electric vehicles. And of course the internal combustion engine. And because the internal combustion engine met the needs, it provided power and stuff like that. And it was easy to get the fuel, and it didn't blow up most of the time, like steam engines tended to do. A lot of time, and that's kind of what propelled us into automobiles, into using internal combustion engines as opposed to other ways of other sources of energy. There is a thing called the Great Breakthrough. All right, now the idea, a lot of times we think of inventors. So if I say who invented the light bulb, you'll say usually Thomas Edison. But social constructivism challenges this idea that technological innovation is just these geniuses coming up with these ideas. All right, that a few talented individuals say, "Oh, guess what? You know, I've come up with this great idea." That there, it says that you know great inventors get a lot of credit for these technological breakthroughs, but they're working with information that comes about through the efforts of so many people behind the scenes that you never ever hear about. Okay, but so why do we say Edison invented the light bulb? Okay, why does he get credit for it? Okay, Well, the thing that happens is that we have an individual or a group of individuals who take these innovations, who take all this cumulative stuff, that information and research and all this other stuff that people are coming up with, and they take that idea and they make it into a workable commercial success that now people can use it long term, easily, all that stuff, right? So let's look at the light bulb and Thomas Edison. Now, he came up with his workable light bulb in the 19, I think it was like 1912 or something, 19s. But way back in 1800, there was a guy called Humphrey Davy who actually started the whole process off. He was playing around with electricity and he was running it through a carbon um, paper. It had a piece of paper that was infused with carbon, and he noticed that when he ran the electrical current through it, it glowed. Of course, it also burned. All right, but that was the beginning of coming up with the idea of the filament inside a incandescent light bulb. Well, another guy came up with a different filament that lasted a little longer. That was William Swan, and 860 years later. And then another guy, Francis Brush, came up with the idea of using a different type of filament, um, and that was a little bit better. But they still, and he actually managed to get electric lighting in a public square, but it didn't last very long. The bulbs didn't last long enough for it to be practical. So Edison went to work on this, and he literally went through thousands of ideas and permutations until he came up with the idea that what if I tried running the current through a bulb that had a vacuum in it, where there's no oxygen? And lo and behold, if you don't have oxygen, you can't burn anything. So he actually, the first one he came up with, that incandescent bulb burned for 40 hours, which was longer than anybody else had managed. And he eventually took that and changes in the filament and stuff like that to make a light bulb that lasted 1,500 hours. Now we are in the realm of usability. So that's why we give him credit. He took these ideas and built upon them, and he came up with that one thing that made it usable to the general public, to a wider audience. Let's look at the Wright brothers, and they are often credited with inventing the airplane, but it's not necessarily true. There were a whole bunch of people who were working on powered flight, and you've probably seen all those old videos of all these crazy looking airplanes crashing with multiple wings and all this other stuff. People had already come up with gliders, but gliders are not powered. There were people who could get the airplane up, but they couldn't control it. So what the Wright brothers did is they were bicycle makers, right? And back in the time when people used bicycles because they couldn't afford a car and they were a lot easier than horses, right? And that's what they used to get around. And Orville and Wilbur looked at this and they took some of the technology that they used on their bicycles and sort of transferred some of those concepts and some of what worked there into their airplane. And they were the first to get a powered airplane to make a sustained, controllable, they could steer it, they could keep it up, flight. And that was it. That was their development. They made it so it was now useful and built upon that. There was another guy called Edward Land, and back in the day, back in the 40s and 50s, you could take your little brownie camera and you took the film canister and you took it down to the drugstore and they sent it off to the lab, and a week later or so later you got your pictures back. Okay? The technology for developing the camera technology and the technology for developing the film were there. Well, Edward Land was on vacation with his daughter, taking pictures, and she looked at him and she said, "Gee, wouldn't it be nice if we could see our pictures right away?" And Edward Land said, "Yeah, it would." So he developed a camera, an easy to use camera that you could take a picture, and then you had these cartridges where it had the chemicals contained in it. And so you could wait a few minutes, and lo and behold, you could see what you just took a picture of. And so he did the Polaroid camera. Now, the technology was there, he just sort of put it together. But he did more than that. He took that idea and marketed it. He took a whole bunch of cameras and cartridges and put them in a couple of department stores right before Christmas to see how it would go over. And people just snapped him up because it was something that they needed. So he was not only the developer, he also was the marketer. So let's talk about the market and technology. Technological innovation is when science that answering the question is showing us how it does, and technology making it usable, and the market, the demand, where people want it and will pay for it, that's where it all comes together. That's where you see the most technological innovation. Scaling up is the transition from that successful research, we know it's there, we know what we're going to use for it, to large scale production. Okay, now we're selling it. Now we're putting it into the marketplace. So where do we find improvement? Well, one of the big places is research. What's out there? How do things work? Stuff like that. One is we improve existing technologies. We make it better. Little tweaks here and there. Another thing is adapting other technologies to improve a different technology, as the Wright brothers did with the bicycle technology to improve airplane technology. The availability of other technologies. We cannot pursue an innovation if we don't have certain technologies. So computers had to wait, even though a guy named Babbage developed a computing machine in the 1800s, it was cumbersome and the effort was too much and it really didn't work all that well. We had to wait until we had electronics and transistors and motherboards and stuff like that. We had to wait for that technology in order to develop computer technology. And entrepreneurs will take other people's inventions and make them into commercial successes. Do you know who Ray Kroc is? If you don't, let me ask you another question. Have you ever ate at McDonald's? Well, Ray Kroc was the force behind McDonald's. The idea of fast food system was not his idea. It was the idea of the McDonald's brothers, who he was selling soda machines to. And he saw what the potential with that and franchising, and he said to him, let's pursue this. And they said, no. He said, well, let me pay you for your idea. And they said, okay. And he paid him what they thought was a gob of money, but he ended up taking that idea that they had and translating it into billions of dollars. So, what do we need? We need effective demand, and effective demand drives the market and drives technological innovation. There is the push and pull to technology. Research and science pushes it up there, okay? And then the public, what they want and what they can use through effective demand, pulls it into our social structure. Effective demand requires three things. Two are essential. One, it requires that technology must exist. If it doesn't exist, we're not going to, there's nothing to use, right? It also must be wanted or needed. If we don't want it and we don't need it, guess what? We're not going to use it. And three, for the most part, we need to be able to afford it. The more people can afford something, the more they're going to use it. All you got to do is think about plasma TVs. Nobody was buying it when they were $8,000, but now that they're flat TVs, that's all people buy anymore, right? And that's it for part one. Part two, we'll talk about developing technology.